Welcome to the Praxis Report. I'm your co-host, William Barth,
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brown.
and today on the Praxis Report, we're going to have an opportunity to interview our very knowledgeable co-host, Jonathan Brown, today, and really looking forward to it on probably the most important issue of our time, and that is peace in our times. And by that, I mean ending this threatened war, this what is potentially a global thermonuclear exchange with the Russian Federation and the Russian peoples in the Ukraine war. And we're going to be getting into that today. But before we do, I want to remind you this is the Praxis Report. We're the podcast that combines political theory analyzation with practice, with what kind of practical initiatives and solutions we can implement after we do our theorizing on political challenges that we face, and how can we solve those challenges with great practical electoral and political strategies. So we think we're a little different in that regard than your average podcast. We don't just analyze the events of the day, a murder, a fire, and a burglary. We don't just do that every day. So we're a little
Right.
different. We're not what they used to call journalism, yellow journalism, or something like that. So we're not that. But anyway, John, welcome. And today, John, we want to get into the Ukraine war in the way the Praxis report does a little bit. So, could you give us sort of your take, not so much on the current status of things, but a little bit on the history of how you think or how you analyze how this conflict arose, namely the war in Ukraine, the occupation of Ukraine by the Russian Federation army. What 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 led to it? How did it come about? And picking up off our last segment of the Praxis report, in which we talk about new states, how are new states created? Because we just talked about that in the last episode. You interviewed me about it. Um, how does this relate to Ukraine? Maybe you could talk a little bit about start there. Where did
Yeah.
Ukraine come from?
Right. Great question. And one thing I would just frame differently is I don't think that Ukraine is under Russian occupation. I think Ukraine has been liberated by the Russian Federation. The Ukrainian territories that are currently being controlled by Nazi forces in Ukraine have been liberated by Russia. But to go into the history, Russia and Ukraine are countries that are very similar. Um, they go back over, I believe, almost 1,000 years to a medieval state called the ancient Rus, Kievan Rus. I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly, but Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, these countries all sort of traced back to a similar medieval kingdom. And it is only in the present times that there was a distinction of Ukraine being its own independent nation, which was a policy in the Soviet Union. They were a member state of the Soviet Union, and for many years they were called Little Russians. That was how we referred to them in the West. And I think the issue with Ukraine is that the United States and the West sought to divide the Soviet Union. Their goal was, of course, to destroy the Soviet Union. So they would attempt during, the Cold War and even before that in World War II, the goal was to turn the populations of countries like Ukraine against the Soviet Union. And so many, of the, national heroes of Ukraine were people that were Nazis during World War II who chose to side with the German Nazis against the Soviet Union and committed atrocities against Russian people. Uh, the real beginning of this war is not actually about Ukraine itself so much as it is about the West's goal of establishing a hegemonic control over the world. And the goal of the United States is essentially the same goal as Nazi Germany had in World War II, which is to strangle Russia, to destroy Russia. Russia is a very large country. It's not a small state like Iraq or Afghanistan that can be easily destroyed by the United States, but it is a very large country geographically, and it has a lot of natural resources that the Nazis wanted to control and the West wants to control, such as their natural gas and oil supply that they supply to most countries in Europe. So the primary issue is that the United States has continued to expand its military war machine to Russia's backyard since the fall of the Soviet Union, to the point where they have sort of pushed Russia up against the wall by attempting to use Ukraine as a pawn in the NATO military apparatus, which would strangle Russia and would basically put US nuclear weapons on Russia's border. So the special military operation was a attempt to prevent both Ukraine from being adopted into the United States military alliance and also to liberate territories that have a predominantly majority Russian ethnic population that were being attacked and bombed and killed by Ukrainian neo-Nazis. And for example, in Crimea, the population voted democratically to leave Ukraine and join Russia, and because they were under attack by Ukrainian extremist groups. So that is, in my analysis, I would say, of where the conflict arose and why it came about.
So how, just not to get sidetracked, but the
Yeah.
problem of Russian minorities in states like Ukraine and other states that emerged when the Soviet Union fell. I think there's some 15 new countries that were established after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine being one of them, but other states as well, the Baltic states, the Azerbaijan,
Yeah.
Tajikistan, all the stands, all of these states emerge. So all states have their minorities. Uh, why is the treatment of Russian minorities in these newly independent countries different or any different than the treatment of minorities in any other state, including the United States?
I don't know if it's different, but the fact is that in many cases, when you have a imperialist power like the United States, their goal is to use tensions over ethnic minority groups as a source of destabilizing a country that they deem as hostile to the interests of U.S. multinational corporations. And we know that in the Soviet Union, they had a very sophisticated policy on minority rights. Lenin and Stalin were very advanced on the national question. People think of the Soviet Union and associate that with Russia because that was, the largest country, but there were several nations, several states that made up the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and those states had self-determination within the Soviet Union. The question of Ukraine being an independent state after the fall of the Soviet Union, unfortunately, the West has invested a lot of money into propagandizing those states, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and others, and trying to bring them into the NATO military apparatus to use them as a sort of weapon to batter Russia with. And I think that that is a primary concern of the Russian people and the Russian Federation is having these countries that are on its border be wrapped up into a military alliance with the West and used to attack them, and for the goal, according to Joe Biden, of actually carrying out a regime change in Russia.
Right. And so, uh, so could you, not to get off topic, but can you talk about Ukrainian sovereignty a little bit? Like how did you see it unfolding? How was Ukrainian sovereignty interfered with uh, by both sides, by either the current occupation. Well, I know you would define it differently, but I'm going to use, the occupation of the, Russian armed forces in Ukraine, and to describe what it is, just because that seems to be a simple way to describe it. But uh, what about other assaults on Ukrainian sovereignty, like the Maidan Revolution, the coup d'état that took place? These are all seem to be threats to Ukrainian sovereignty. You want to
Uh, uh,
comment on sovereignty a little bit, or?
Yeah, so I think that one of the propaganda phrases we hear in the West in the media is that Putin attacked a sovereign state, and they say it's an unprovoked attack. Now, what actually happened is that Ukraine ceased to be a sovereign state in 2014 when the Ukrainian prime minister at the time sought a sort of peaceful relations with Russia, and he sought to kind of create neutrality and diplomacy with both the West and with Russia. And this was something that the United States could not tolerate. So they orchestrated a coup d'état and overthrew overthrew Ukraine's government in order to install to power a puppet regime, a client state that would be friendly to the West, would do the bidding of Washington. And now we have Zelensky, who is Ukraine's prime minister, who is essentially a tool of the Western imperialist. He has no sovereignty whatsoever. And in fact, he is an outright dictator. He has abolished all freedom of press. He has abolished elections. He has abolished all political parties that oppose him. And yet we are told in the West that he is a liberal Democrat. He is a hero. We must protect democracy by supporting Ukraine. In my opinion, Ukraine is not a sovereign nation. It is no longer a independent nation as long as it is a vassal state, a client state that is under the control of the United States government and is used as a pawn to launder money and weapons, to use them as cannon fodder for a war against Russia, then it ceases to be a sovereign state. And I think Russia themselves recognize that. They recognize that Ukraine, even though they're at war with Ukraine, they are technically not really at war with Ukraine. It is really the United States and the entire Western world, all the other, Western European countries that are also doing the bidding of Washington. So it is actually a U.S. war of aggression against the Russian Federation that's happening here, with Ukraine being used as a puppet or a pawn, with their soldiers being drafted as cannon fodder for the U.S.'s imperialist ambitions in Russia.
Um, so we had some interesting events that happened over the last couple of days. Maybe you could pull up some of the news clippings on what's happened over the last day or two, literally,
Yeah.
with regard to this, because you seems to be supporting kind of the argument you're making that this is in effect some kind of a contest or competition between the United States of America and the Russian Federation, and that Ukraine is sort of a sideshow in the thing, because if you pull up this clip where it says it's a CNN clip that Trump makes a call and engages in direct negotiations, not with Ukraine or not some international conference on the status and sovereignty and future of the Ukrainian state, but direct negotiations between the president of the United States and the president of the Russian Federation to settle their differences. You want to comment on that a little bit?
Sure. I think there's a lot of things we could say about this. One thing is that the Ukraine war was supported by primarily the Democratic Party. Now, of course, the Republican Party, the establishment neoconservative wing of the Republican Party, like Lindsey Graham and people like that, they 100% were down supporting the Ukraine war. But there was a more libertarian, populist wing that were associated with MAGA and Trump that were somewhat more skeptical of the Ukraine war. And in fact, in many cases, the only votes against arming Ukraine came from Republicans, not Democrats. Now, there's many reasons for this. I think the Democratic base in the United States has been turned into a sort of foaming at the mouth anti-Russian Cold War McCarthyites, in a large part because in 2016, when Hillary Clinton lost the election to Trump, the Democrats invented a conspiracy theory that Russia stole the election and Russia rigged the election in favor of Trump, and so that Trump was this stooge of Vladimir Putin. And of course, they want us to think Putin is, an evil dictator that is seeking to, take over the world. And so liberals in the West, not just in the United States, across the Western Europe as well, have become fanatical Cold War McCarthyites who simply are foaming at the mouth to go to war with Russia. And so the irony here is that the MAGA movement has been, with their idea of putting America first, has been the strongest voice of opposition to the U.S. Proxy war against the Russian Federation. Now, this phone call with Trump and Putin is one of the reasons for a while that I was saying that if we are going to have to pick a so-called lesser of two evils on the Ukraine question, on the Russian question, I believe Trump would end up being the lesser of two evils if he is able to pursue a diplomatic peace settlement with Russia and avoid the catastrophe of a nuclear war between America and Russia. And his claim when he got elected was that he was going to solve the problem on day one. It's now, of course, been a couple of months,
Yes.
but
Typical Trump, right?
Trump
Typical Trump.
boasts,
Yeah,
he's going to
Trump.
get
Yeah,
in there
right.
immediately. But
Right.
the irony is that this is the very first time that anyone in the United States, any government official, has had a conversation with Russia. Biden did not speak to Putin. They did not talk to him once. It was Trump
It's
who did
just
it.
amazing, John, isn't it? That we live in a time, coming through the START talks and the nuclear test ban treaty, and President John Fitzgerald Kennedy and the Dick Nixon's détente initiatives. We lived in a world in which it was assumed, it was taken for granted that this country, the United States, would do everything in its power to prevent a global thermonuclear exchange between the United States and the Russian peoples, between Americans and Russians. Everything in its power,
That's right.
and we would do everything in our power to try to negotiate, to have détente, to understand problems from the other's point of view, as the Russians did when so-called offensive weapons or missiles were placed in Cuba. 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and as is happening right now today, where NATO threatens potential missile sites aimed at how many miles from Ukraine to Moscow, or uh,
Well,
so
right, and the Ukrainians have been attacking directly into Russian territory, and with American weapons.
But
So
wouldn't that, I mean, my God, if you're going to go to war, and the war is between Russian Federation and Ukraine, then you go to war with the Russian Federation. I mean, that's sort of the irony of it, isn't it? But wasn't it very clearly the Liberal Democrats' goal to go to war with the Russian Federation? Regime change. They say they wanted regime change in the Russian Federation. Well, that's, for God's sakes, it's an act of war. Why not call it what it is? The Liberal Democrats wanted war with Russia and potentially global or thermonuclear war. And they didn't rule out the use of nuclear weapons. Not
that's
at
right,
all.
and they pushed us very close to nuclear confrontation with Russia. I mean, Biden directly stated that I believe his words were, Putin must go, or something to that effect.
Right.
The goal, the policy of the U.S. in that regard was that they would break Russia up into, what we call balkanization.
Yeah, balkanize the state. Yeah.
They would take, Russia and destroy it, but turn it into small little, mini states, mini territories that could each be ruled as kind of vassals of U.S. interests and would serve our bidding, so that Russia would no longer be one large federation, one big country.
Basically, a failed state of just a failed, corrupted, marginalized,
That's right.
divided
Yeah.
nation, like we've done to other countries where we have created regime change, whether it be Libya or Iraq or other countries where we fought these what they call endless wars or regime change wars.
That's right. And the goal, I think, with Russia was that Russia is a much a bigger country than the other targets of the war on terror. The United States could go into Iraq, but we could overthrow the Iraq's government. We could overthrow Afghanistan and Libya, Syria, and that's been successful. But the big change that's happening in the world is a shift that's taking place. It is still in process, it is not complete, but there is a shift from a unipolar world, which means a world where there is one power, that is, the US government rules over the entire world. And since the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States was the unchecked power. The good thing about the Soviet Union that people in the West, including Western socialists and leftists, so called socialists, in the West fail to recognize is that the power of the US empire was kept in check by the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union existed, the United States had another power in the world that prevented the US somewhat from acting unilaterally. And it also meant that because there was a socialist country that served as a beacon of hope to the working class, that means the Western countries had to give their workers some kind of rights and some kind of quality of standard of living. But since the Soviet Union fell, the US no longer had to do any of that. And so that's why we've seen in the last 30, 40 years a decline in the standard of living, decline in wages, stagnating economies, and a kind of return to this neo-feudalist debt-driven society with a low wages and police apparatus that controls the population and mass homelessness and inflation. And of course, the U.S. government acting as this barbaric war machine that goes and topples Iraq and topples Afghanistan and topples Syria and topples Libya. Now, this all stopped because Russia was going to stand up and say, no, you are not going to do what you did to Iraq to us. And Putin himself, he even said he looked at what happened in 2011 when Obama went into Libya. NATO attacked Libya, destroyed Libya, and Gaddafi was murdered. And Hillary Clinton cheered and she said, we came, we saw, he died. She was laughing. There's a video of this. And Putin watched the video of this happening. He watched Gaddafi being murdered and he said it was his great mistake, his great shame that he was not able to prevent Libya from being destroyed by the US. So I think Putin recognizes this, that there needs to be a new world of multipolarity where we recognize the sovereignty of other countries. And Russia is a multipolar power in the world. They're a civilization, a state with its own sovereignty that has to be recognized. And I think the fact that Trump is giving Putin a phone call and saying we need to come to an end here is the U.S. empire recognizing its own limitations, that it can't do to Russia what it did to Iraq and Afghanistan, that we have to respect somewhat the sovereignty of Russia. And that is, I think, a shift away from U.S. Unipolar domination.
It seems that Trump even went further than that. I don't want to belabor any particular point, but it seems that what's so historic about it is Trump went further and he praised, the historic alliance between Americans and Russians with regard to World War II and the defeat of Nazi Germany and this sort of historic friendship between the two peoples. And it's something we see so little of today that, like you say, the liberal Democrats have degenerated and abandoned the traditions of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and George McGovern and all of the great peace-loving Democrats of the 60s and beyond. And just degenerated into the sort of the victory of the LBJ Joe Biden wing, which a party of war, a party controlled and influenced by the military, what they call the military industrial complex. These are the big war manufacturers, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, Raytheon, and so forth, Honeywell, on and on. and they've been sort of corrupted in this way, and they need a policy that keeps the money flowing to these huge corporations that produce war, the machines of war. And war is war qua war itself is really the great threat to humanity. It's the existential threat to humanity. And so I think just Trump's initiative in this regard is so meaningful. It really, for all his imperfection, I don't see how we can do anything but support him.
I agree, and I think that one thing I would say to any of our listeners, and this is something I say to my liberal friends who demonize Russia and China, is that look, you don't have to agree with Vladimir Putin. You don't have to agree with his political system or how his policies are. You're not living in Russia. But what we should be doing is respecting the sovereignty of other nations and allow those nations to determine how they wish to rule themselves. And the big problem in the West is that we have been ruling over the rest of the world by force. And that is something that needs to be coming to an end. We need to realize that our enemy is not Russia. Our enemy is not China. Our enemy is the financial oligarchies on Wall Street and the bankers and the military contractors and the war machine in Washington. That is our enemy. That is the enemy of America, is within, the enemy of the monopoly capitalist, military industrial complex, and that is pushing for permanent war, permanent war, permanent war, while the American people are starving and struggling and can barely survive and make ends meet. So they want us to think Russia's our enemy. They want us to fear Russia, fear China, think that they're our enemy, while we are missing the fact that the true enemy is the people in our own society that are trying to destroy the conditions of life for people in America in order to create this permanent war economy. And I think that if we can respect other countries' sovereignty, respect our own sovereignty, respect our own people, that is the solution to this problem. And I think for all of that which I would critique Donald Trump and
Right.
cohort for, the issue of putting America first in the sense that we need to rebuild America and stop being entangled in foreign wars with other countries, I think that is the direction that Marxists and socialists and communists can agree that we need to do that first and foremost. And that's where the issue with Russia and Ukraine could have been resolved without a single shot have been or a bomb have been dropped if that was put into place 2 years ago by the Democrats, but it wasn't.
Right. John, very well said, very well summarized. And I think we can sort of take that as the summarization of your interview. I just might add that I think the American people agree with you in large part in their rejection of the war machine, their rejection of Harris-Biden or Biden-Harris. And the liberal Democrats, this victory of Donald Trump in nearly every swing state, I think it was every swing state,
Yeah.
shows that the American people, I think, agree with you with that analysis in that regard. They don't want war. I've gotten some debates in recent days with friends over whether war itself was the determining issue of the campaign. But there is support for that, certainly in the swing states, not just in swing states where there are large Arab American populations who disagreed with the war on Palestine and the genocidal campaign that was launched against Palestinians, but in other swing states as well, even where there are not necessarily large Arab American populations. I think the American voter agrees with you to that extent, and I think you're onto something. And you summarize the thing very well. So we're gonna get into that in future episodes because we have to somehow apply all of this to the electoral challenges that progressives face in light of this. And so we're going to get on into that on future episodes. And with that, I want to ask our listeners, please, if you enjoyed our little discussion today and John's analysis of the Ukraine war, please press your like button, help our algorithms, and join the, what's the name of the
Patreon.
Patreon.
That's
We
right.
ask you to join Patreon if you can get special access to Praxis reports and articles and interesting thoughts. And thank you for tuning in today. We're going to continue this discussion and try to determine how we can apply theorization and political theory to practical approaches and strategies to try to change things for the better and create a better, newer world. So thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Peace.